Oh. You're back. This is awkward. You're here expecting a video about something, but all I've got are some expensive light novels heavy enough to crush a baby's skull. Sorry, I don't have a prop for that one. That's probably illegal. But since you were kind enough to come back for this continued exploration into the saga of Tanya the Evil, I guess it's safe to assume that you're in this for the long haul. My condolences. My original plan was to cover the next 5 books in the franchise because that's what makes up essentially the next major arc in the series, excluding Book 8 because that's starting the following major arc. Then I got off my dead ass, decided to watch the movie, as well as thought about all those precious YouTube cents flowing right into my pocket by milking this franchise for all it's worth. Which is why I realized that, hey, I can cover the 4th volume in its own video because that's basically what the movie's adapting. That was your cue to bounce if you weren't looking for movie or book spoilers. So let's get into the plot so far, and if you're familiar with the movie but not the books, buckle up. Picking up where we last left off with Tanya and her battalion, I have to back up a bit, because I sort of glossed over the events at the end of the 3rd volume, at least a little too quickly, and skipped over some context as to why the war is so goddamn complicated. Also, this stuff is covered in the movie and not the anime, so I have that going for me. After their defeat at the Rhine, the Republican army Dunkirks to the southern continent under the leadership of Major General DeLugo. The ceasefire was just a ploy to buy time so that they could do that, which the Empire obviously took. We get way too much info on the politics of the Republic and its colonies here, but basically the military posts down there are like a retiree position, where old fucks go to live out their twilight years, and they really don't want to listen to the general or band together to fight the Empire. So he boots them all out and concentrates his power and influence to mount a proper resistance. Now the Empire is embroiled in a war on 2 fronts again because after the Republic's defeat and subsequent restructuring under the Free Republic, the Commonwealth quit being a neutral country, officially entering the war, despite obviously throwing their support behind the Alliance and Republic to that point, and trying their best to sabotage the Empire's war efforts. However, the war between the Empire and Commonwealth is at a standstill, as the Commonwealth lacks the manpower to launch a full-scale land invasion against the Empire's substantial land military. But the Commonwealth is also the early 20th century Britain analog, so their navy is fuck off huge, to the point that the Empire's 2 navies are only about the size of the Commonwealth's home fleet, and they don't really want to waste their ships in naval combat that would just lead to defeat. Furthermore, the Unified States, guarantee I will slip up and call them the United States at some point during this video, is still maintaining neutrality in the same way that the Commonwealth did, by sending aid to the Free Republic and Commonwealth, while taunting the Empire's ships into attacking them as an excuse to enter the war. Tanya points out that they should absolutely not attack the Unified States under any circumstances until there are no other threats remaining, because she knows how that ends. So, there's the backdrop to the hopeless war situation, when Tanya's sent to the southern continent to finish off the Republican army. Stationed there under General Rommel. Not sure if that's supposed to be the General Rommel from our history, but I'm inclined to believe it is, as it's the only high-ranking military officer who's shown any competence so far. But the Empire's general staff doesn't want to send enough resources down south to finish things off quickly because it's deemed too minor to really warrant the effort, so they've been having a perpetual skirmish war going on, where the Empire is severely outmanned and gunned, but keeps pulling out victories by essentially outmaneuvering the Republican forces due to Rommel's exceptional leadership, to the point they capture a key port town. Good for them. Tanya lands down there, meets with Rommel, and he's about as businesslike as Tanya. And the two come to a sort of professional understanding, until Tanya asks for the freedom to act as she pleases in combat. He's reluctant to agree because everyone wants that, but he knows her record, so he's not quick to dismiss it as arrogance. While her and her battalion are out on patrol, she notices the Republic Army isn't where their intel says it should be, partially due to the Commonwealth interfering through feeding fake intel through local sources, so that must mean they're not spread out, but clumped together so they can spearhead through the Imperial lines. Tanya tries to radio, but it doesn't work, so she and her battalion charge through and pull some shit where they break through one of the flanks, which makes the Republic try and cut them off, but they blast through and go straight for their field command. The Republican mage we met in RN, I told you he'd be relevant for a few books, despite me glossing over his role of looking shocked while the Rhine front fell, realizes they're going to take out the command like they did on the Rhine, and has DeLugo take cover so he doesn't die.
Once the command is destroyed, Rommel notices the Republic fleeing, so he has all of his forces charge at them, while laughing like a madman, as he realizes Tanya's best use is to let her do what she wants to do, because she has great intuition, and strategies just sort of fall into place when she's there. After that stint, she and her troops earn their much-deserved leave back in the home country. Or not. Tanya's met with Lurgan and Uger, who give her some top-secret orders for her and her battalion to ship out immediately on a massive air quotes here training exercise in deep recon on the Rusi Federation border. And they just so happen to go way past it. Oh no. What an unfortunate and totally not planned accident. Once up in the plane, which is where Volume 4 begins proper, Tanya laments the cramped conditions for her troops, despite her being mostly fine due to her small size. Once the designated time comes, she's allowed to open her sealed orders, calls over Weiss, and the two read them, where she learns that the Federation is likely about to declare war, due to intel from Imperial spies over the border going silent just before sending out a warning. She has Weiss get the battalion's attention and give the orders, because it's about this time that the author remembers that Tanya's supposed to be a little girl, and has her struggle to talk loud enough in the plane for people to hear her without straining her vocal cords. So their real mission is to get dropped off, find where the Federation is, and get some fresh intel on the situation so the Empire can prepare for hell, or to negotiate. It doesn't take them long to find the Federation, prepping with forward barracks, armored units, and just an obscene amount of artillery. You know, the actual big guns that can hit the Empire from where they currently are. And would you look at that? Turns out they're all pointed at the Empire too. That alone is tantamount to a declaration of war. But Tanya reminds her troops that they can't make the first strike since the Federation has to be the ones to actually declare war, so their unit can't be blamed for breaking the treaty. So they're just watching, with Tanya trying to figure out when to strike because she's certain it's only a matter of time. That is until she doesn't actually get the chance to make a decision. All along the front, the railway guns fire, and a declaration of war comes from the Eastern Army Group, telling all units, regardless whom you report to engage. Her unit fires up their computation orbs and takes to the sky, targeting the ammunition stockpiles to cripple the artillery first, while watching out for enemy mages. But curiously, there don't seem to be any. Tanya, after none have attacked while her unit is getting almost Dacia level resistance from the ground, realizes that they can do more than just blow up some artillery. Radioing to the general staff, she asks for special permission with political consideration to launch a harassing attack on the Federation capital. The call hits the general staff and they debate it for a hot second, until they realize her unit is experts at decapitation tactics, and harassing the capital would peel some of the massive Federation army away from the front for defense. She's given the go-ahead, and her unit flies right on over to Moskva. There we pop into the point of view of a weird children's book about the founding of the communist regime in the Federation, where we're introduced to Joseph, the General Secretary, and Loria, the Commissariat for Internal Affairs, as they whitewash the labor camps for political opponents, as putting their large unemployed population to work. Then we get into why the Federation declared war. At the end of Volume 3 in the Heavenly Realm, where Being X's pantheon exists, some beings are discussing how faith is progressing across the world, except one is worried about his corner, as atheism has become rampant. This is where we find one has a scheme to get some religiousness into the populace, with war, because that breeds strife and, subsequently, faith. This pays off in Chapter 1 of Volume 4, where it approaches Joseph in a dream and tells him to fight the Empire. Being a rational guy, he brushes it off because God isn't real, but his paranoia about the West isn't forgotten, as he and Loria, who was also having that dream, launch an attack to finish off their enemies before they get attacked themselves. Once at Moskova, we see Loria patrolling for little girls because he's an unabashed pedophile. I swear that seems like a terrible trait to hang on a villain, because it's so obviously evil it's almost comical, but considering the protagonist is, at this point, a 12-year-old girl, you see where that's going. Also helps that it's outright disgustingly presented. It's not fetishized. Anyway, he sees Tanya's unit as they start unloading on the capital, destroying any political buildings they can, before planting their flag they stole from the propaganda mill, and singing their national anthem over the enemy capital. Her singing is what really gets Lori's attention, as he vows to capture his naughty little fairy, gross, and make her his. Double gross. The attack is recorded by the unit and taken home where it's shared like popcorn among the populace. And why did Tanya do this? Well, because she fucking hates communists. Like, this whole book and most of the next one is spent railing against communism as an ideology, but not like on an intellectual or economic level, but just how stupid and inept they are. So her living out her fantasy of destroying the Soviet capital is just the best, and she playfully tells her troops to burn it all to the ground, entertaining any of their ideas about what to do with whimsical fancy.
Now, bombing the enemy capital during a war is a good thing, you would think. It sends a strong message of, don't fuck with us. But when you plant your flag and sing your national anthem in the enemy's political square, that pretty thoroughly trounces their pride, and good luck jumping into peace negotiations after that. We blew up your shit and metaphorically laid claim to your capital. Want to call this whole war thing off? Doesn't quite follow, does it? So while Tanya did an unprecedented thing, created some juicy propaganda, and asked for permission to do all that with political consideration in mind, she's got some people in the General Staff as well as the Supreme Council, that'd be the political arm of the Empire for you, more than a bit upset at her actions, as she just waltzed in and shot dead the possibility of a peace treaty anytime soon. Stoking that level of nationalistic fervor is gonna come back to bite her.
After their victory over the capital, Tanya and her troops returned to the Eastern Army Group's rear base for some cheers and praise by local troops. But the General Staff is still in a bind, with the massive Federation force staring down the numerically inferior Eastern Group. I don't think I talked about this. The army groups are small armies, specifically 2 or more field armies, which in turn consists of 2 or more corps, which consists of 2 or more divisions, meant to hold the fort and are the basis of the interior line strategy, where the Empire has perfected defense by keeping smaller armies at its border, with its main force able to quickly deploy through its rail network. The Empire's main army, the Great Army, doesn't have exact numbers specified, but enough that before the Rhine front became the quagmire it was, they could easily mobilize 70 divisions within a week. And the Rhine front towards the end of the Republic's days is stated to have about 100 active divisions on each side. A division is about 6,000 to 25,000 soldiers or so. So when intel comes from the General Staff that the battalion is going to be engaging in mobile defense of the front, to put out fires and help the offensive push forward in the north, by sweeping down on the Federation's forces, and they're staring down 150 divisions in the east with another 25 marching down into the Empire-controlled Dacia, all while the Empire's intelligence placed the standing Federation army at about 125 divisions total, you see why they're worried. But Tanya has a request put forward by the Eastern Command to assist with their troops under siege at the Empire city of Tegenhof. Tanya, looking over a map, realizes the city has a ton of strategic value as a staging platform for the Empire's sweeping offensive down the front, so she decides to use the leeway granted to her with this mobile defense to break the siege of Tegenhof. She pops in, saves some mages, delivers some cigarettes and booze, and her battalion sweeps up the onslaught of Federation infantry. However, Tanya's unit is playing this safe because they don't want to get caught with their pants down for possible Federation mages. So they keep trying to bait out their mages only to get disappointed. That is until Tanya realizes that since they're not sending any up, or haven't at this point, at all, they must not have any. So she and her battalion, with their air superiority, wipe out the 8 divisions of infantry and save Tegenhof. However, this has left Moskva with the distinct impression that mages are actually useful, seeing how they're kicking their infantry's asses left and right, and Loria, using every resource he has to get Tanya into his clutches, is willing to free all the former military mages currently in internment camps. Upon getting back and leading to a successful offensive that pushes the Federation back, getting the Great Army there, and solidifying the lines somewhat, Tanya is immediately court-martialed for her actions in the Federation capital, due to her irreparably damaging their chances of negotiating a peace treaty. But it's essentially the opposite of a kangaroo court, where she's sure to be found innocent, since she cleared it with proper channels, delivered a blow that eased the pressure on the lines, and has the military supporting her, as her direct superior is overseeing the trial. As the court and military officers take turns reaming the prosecutors for wasting time and attacking a hero, Tanya is let off, and given a special reward, the ability to pick her next assignment. Not in a phony way either. So given her once-in-a-lifetime chance, she jumps on it and immediately requests to be stationed in the rear. This infuriates Zetor, her direct superior, and head of the service corps, who basically finds all the crap and does the logistics for war. He shrieks at her that she's a decorated war hero who served pivotal roles in all their decisive victories in the war so far. Why in the hell would somebody like that want to take an easy job in the rear? To which Tanya is genuinely baffled, because why would she stay on the front where she could die? when she would much rather develop strategies. Probably one of my favorite scenes from this entire series is Lurkin just sitting there pretending he doesn't exist, so he doesn't get dragged into this whole mess, and remarking how the military is Tanya's only real authority figure in her life, since she was basically raised by the army, and given her age, she might just be entering a rebellious phase. And it's just a funny bit. Anyway, interest piqued in the idea of research, Zetor grants Tanya's position in the rear to develop a new combat strategy. She's sent back to the former Rhine front, which now has the bare minimum of personnel, as it's mostly just a few skirmishes with the Commonwealth. There she's testing equipment with her battalion and scrambling to fight the constant Commonwealth harassment attacks. While out, she befriends some fighter pilots who almost attacked them, thinking they were enemies due to rain, but didn't, so they became close. And that's all so Tanya can call on them for a favor later on. Let's jump on over to Mary Sue, who has, until this point, been in the background of the series. When we last left her, she had indeed signed up with the Unified States military as a mage, against her father's wishes as he didn't believe that having magic meant they had to fight, but Mary wants to take back her homeland and get revenge against the Empire. Once enlisted, she's grouped with a volunteer force of Entente Alliance refugees who are sent over to the Commonwealth for training. There she learns the basics of shooting, cleaning, flying in formation, and is pretty much your average rookie mage. Back to Tanya, she's given some heavy guns to test to see if a mage unit can basically become a mobile air tank, but while flying to their testing grounds, gets a call from the Western Front Command saying she needs to stop her testing and head to the Commonwealth shore to pick up a downed crew for evac. She declines because they're literally not her boss, but they tell her these orders are from the General Staff, so Tanya bites her tongue and drops the expensive gear to go pick up the VIPs stranded in the Commonwealth. Having the foresight to realize that mages can't very well fly over the English Channel with passengers while evading fire, she radios for some support, and calls in that favor for escorting those fighter pilots earlier. Back in the Commonwealth, Mary's freshly minted unit is called into an emergency briefing where she's given orders by her superior officer, and a Commonwealth Marine mage named Lieutenant Colonel Drake. He will be important for the rest of this series. She's told an elite mage unit is on their way, and have been tentatively identified as the Devil of the Rhine, but some consider that a myth and laugh it off. That is until Drake steps up and flat out tells them the Devil of the Rhine is real, and she will kill them all. Their best course of action is to not engage and run like their lives depend on it, because it literally does. And if they can't, get shot down because they're over home turf, so they can be rescued easily. Their goal isn't to wipe them out, it's to deflect. Anyway, back to Tanya's unit as she immediately sends off a company to evac the VIPs while backing up the planes. Tanya and the rest of the battalion engage Mary's battalion, as well as a Commonwealth mage battalion there too, led by Drake. They almost wipe them out without issue and pick off the rest. Tanya notices Mary struggling to hang on, but she's out of bullets in her trusty machine gun, so she has to do a dive attack where she normally finishes with a bayonet to the gut, but she doesn't have one, and settles for the butt of her machine gun instead. As she hits Mary, she grabs the gun and notices that it's the one she gave her father, because it's got the same engraving, and just like that it clicks that Tanya, or as she knows her, the Devil of the Rhine, killed her father, and she falls unconscious. Tanya pulls out after getting a call for the successful evac, and they report back to base. Later, Tanya delivers her final research to the General Staff on, get ready for some serious butchering here, I am not great with German, Kampfgruppe and tactics, which Tanya basically stole wholesale from the Nazis, and the Kaiserreich to a lesser extent. She packages this variable ad hoc formation together, and sends a theory report to the General Staff, and is promoted to Lieutenant Colonel herself due to her recent string of accomplishments. It's here Tanya is confronted by, now Major Weiss, as he asks for the Mage Battalion to be a part of Tanya's soon-to-be formed Kampfgruppe, him now taking command of the battalion in her stead. She laughs it off because she's not going to get a Kampfgruppe. That would just be absurd. Until she gets a call from Zetor telling her that she's been given a Kampfgruppe to test drive as a formation strategy, codenamed Salamander. She has a few days to get back to Central, where her infantry, armor, and artillery units are to be assigned to her, and she's expected to report to the Eastern Front almost immediately after. I would say that's the end of the book, but it's not. The last chapter is spent with Tanya hassling people and supplies for more up-to-date tanks, replacing the entire command staff of her infantry unit, and having lengthy debates while name-dropping Rommel again to get what she wants. Which is ultimately a waste of time, as we'll see in the next video. But we end with Tanya heading to the Eastern Front, with the ominous notion that Loria is not just getting the Federation mages out of the camps to fight for him, but possibly restructuring the entire military so it's more efficient. And also they've shifted strategies, both internally and externally, as the Communist Party is good at two things: propaganda and making people like them. So now they're off to go make some friends.
And that right there will wrap up the book's recap for you, which took entirely too long, but the more this series goes on, the more complex the politics get. If you're more familiar with the movie, I'm sure this vaguely sounded like the events in it, but holy hell did things get shuffled around, to put it mildly. And that brings us to the next big talking point: what they changed from the light novels and why.
So to clarify, the movie is an adaptation of the fourth volume of the books, though it's drastically different, not just in tone, but plot-wise too. And this has a lot to do with the fact that the medium is different, as visual mediums take more inspiration from theater than novels, which can follow a looser, less focused tradition, where a less tangible flow of time allows for reminding the audience about characters or events that haven't been relevant for a few installments. That means there doesn't have to be a strict climax in an ongoing book series, where a movie and anime are beholden to that. For one, they can't guarantee they'll get another installment, but mainly, they're going to be destroyed by word of mouth or reviews about how not satisfying it is. There has to be something for the audience to walk away from feeling like the events wrapped up or at least amounted to something. But books can largely avoid that issue by being part of a larger ongoing series that's easily revisitable. For this, a book is more akin to an episode rather than an entire season of a show, which is why it's also hard to describe a real tangible threat in these, because Tanya sort of lacks a struggle. Like, sure, she has obstacles, but until this point, she hasn't lost a single member of her battalion in combat. There was one, but he got food poisoning on the Rhine, and that's why Grants is in her battalion, not because he was there from the start like he is in the anime. But they come out of every combat encounter mostly unscathed. Follow me for a bit here. They bombed the Eastern Front in this book without taking any hits, attacked the enemy capital with 0 injuries, saved a town under siege with minor injuries, evac'd someone downed in enemy territory while fighting 2-to-1 odds and came out without anybody dying, and that's just in this volume. Tanya sees regular promotions and praise for the constant success and suicide missions she's tasked with. What is standing in her way? What is the villain of this series from the audience's standpoint? And sure, people would say being X, but as I've said before in the light novels, he's almost entirely absent, and any interference by beings in his pantheon are entirely coincidental. But there is something that is actively working against Tanya, and it's the outright abysmal war situation itself. No matter how well Tanya and her unit do, she can't change the course of the war, and is stuck in a perpetual situation where she's forced to kill or be killed, constantly outdoing herself so she can be one step ahead of her opponents. And that doesn't really make for a compelling movie villain. Existential pessimism can't really get punched or defeated in an hour and a half, or even in 12 episodes. Which is why I understand the changes made in the movie. And flat out, for the experience they're going for, this is a positive change. So let me quit beating around the bush. The biggest change in this series is making Mary Sue more involved in the story, while giving her a massive boost in power to compensate as an antagonist to Tanya. This is the largest change in a number of ways. Not just Mary's power level, because, as I mentioned in my last video, mage power levels aren't exactly a good indicator of how tough an opponent is. Experience is what they're worried about. Having all the firepower in the world doesn't really matter if you don't have the common sense to dodge, avoid detection, and hit strategically important targets while also not getting your unit killed. So her having a nigh inexhaustible source of magic wouldn't make her such a devastating threat to Tanya's battalion. They'd more than likely just outmaneuver her. Or just completely bomb the area so it's filled with carbon dioxide and she'd choke to death. That's a thing they've done before. But inserting her into the Eastern Theater at this point does have some varying degrees of plot-altering significance down the line. As previously stated in the recap, Mary's training began in the Commonwealth, where she was picked off easily by Tanya for being incredibly green. She doesn't play a role in the Battle of Tegenhof at all, because the Federation has no mage forces in this stage of the war at all. That means the Battle of Tegenhof is amped up to be a bigger climax for the series, as they smash the events at the end of the book into the events at the beginning to make one conflict flow a bit better, while also creating a more satisfying climax for the movie. And instead of aerial mages once again demonstrating the power of air superiority, these look like any battle we had on the Rhine. But what does seem odd, and carrying a bigger role is the multinational unit being there period at this stage in the story. They're showing up about an entire book too early, and that's a pretty major plot point in the 5th volume, and that has implications going through the rest of the story. I'll talk about them when I cover the 5th volume, but for now, let's just talk about how awkward this makes things. For one, it implies that the Empire's intelligence is good enough to know the Federation is mobilizing a force with enough warning to send scouts in, while apparently being too incompetent to notice the Federation and Commonwealth fostering friendly relations and troop loans. But this really impacts the Federation's political mindset more, making it less consistent. They had originally planned to steamroll the Empire easily with their number of machines, believing their science-based technology was better than the mystical relics of mages the Empire still clung to. It takes that resounding defeat in the early stages of the war in the East to make the Federation partially abandon its communist dogma that's hampering its military might. Gloria recognizes how powerful mages are, and immediately sets into motion a plan to get the mages back on the front lines from the concentration camps. Seeing the Empire being so brutish, has them work their propaganda mill on the Commonwealth to secure an ally in the future. By inserting the multinational unit in at this point, it implies the Federation is already thinking about these things before openly declaring war. They did so because they feared the Western countries were plotting against them. So why would they already be plotting with the West to take down the Empire? From a narrative standpoint, that's entirely fine. These changes won't even have profound impacts on the later story, they just make it a bit more complicated if you spend way too much time thinking about it. And that's what I'm here for. But these are changes I can get behind for the movie, as it streamlines the plot by removing the need for Tanya to go to the former Rhine front to fight Mary, then an entire chapter of her getting her conf group together. That's the unnecessary fat that needed trimmed, so it has my seal of approval there. But rather than focusing on what the book did different from the movie, what part of the novels did a better job? I mentioned in my last video I did on this franchise how the books differed from the anime adaptation with what they chose to focus on. The anime is more action-oriented and tells a story about Tanya beating the odds, while the books are a political drama with Tanya being a marble in a pinball machine. And Volume 4 is where the series really hits its stride conveying the politics of the world we're seeing. Volumes 1 through 3 had the Republic, Alliance, and Dacia, but we really didn't spend time with their government officials in any capacity, nor did we really get a glimpse of why they're fighting. At least not firsthand. Hansen Sue mentions how the politicians in the Alliance drank their own nationalistic Kool-Aid by declaring war on the Empire, and believing they could win, but Volume 4 is where we really get into the head of General DeLugo, as he talks about the Free Republic's inner workings, and how he restructured their military so he could strike a decisive blow against the Empire. We see how it looks from their perspective as those plans crumble. We meet the Stalin analog in the General Secretary Joseph, and understand how the communist government and the Federation works through Loria's interactions with various party members. We spend time in the Commonwealth, and see their espionage missions pay off, as well as getting introduced to their leadership, why they waited to declare war, as well as their plans moving forward. This all builds a web of why these groups work together or fight one another, while strengthening the conflict in this series, by showing the stakes of the Empire actually winning, and why these people don't want it to. Tanya's characterization is probably one of the most interesting aspects to give attention to. The book spends so much time in Tanya's head and moments with her interacting with others that it's completely different from the other adaptations. She's fairly consistent in the anime and movie, being a little girl who's both mature and relishes in others' misery, but that's not quite the case in the books. Not to say she's inconsistent. Just what the author chooses to focus on seems to change depending on his mood. For the first arc of the series, you can tell how absolutely infatuated the guy was with the mental image of a sadistic little girl soldier being ruthless on the battlefield. Other characters constantly remark about how this little girl isn't even older than their own daughter, or how she reminds them of their daughter. But she's out here killing people, and that's so wrong. And there's even points where Tanya's character breaks down for these sort of scenes, like her skipping off when her new unit gets to go kill some people, or talking about how useful shovels are for killing enemies. That sort of thing is only there to make you horrified at her, but that's not who Tanya really is as a person. Though, as I already mentioned earlier, the later volumes focus less on the earth-shattering idea of, wow, that little girl is creepy, and go more into what limitations Tanya's body imposes on her job duties. That she's actually sort of embarrassed by asking for help or to address these issues. She's small, so talking in a loud cargo plane would mean she'd need to shriek just so she could be heard. She's a kid, so she's not at all intimidating when she's interrogating people. She learns to delegate those things, but often has to remind those around her, who are so used to Tanya, they forget she's just a little girl. That's more believable, since she certainly doesn't act like one. And it at least does something with the whole child on a battlefield angle that the anime just seems to ignore, so it gets some praise there.
If you're watching the anime for this series, you're not getting any less of an experience. In fact, the political drama stuff is interesting to me, but more in the way of a History Channel special. The anime is obviously the more engaging experience, both visually and for the time investment, I guess. And it has actual conflict that's tangible for Tanya and the audience. But damn if that whole futility of war message just doesn't resonate as well in the anime. As the book version of Tanya is constantly fighting uphill for peace, only to be smacked back down into the mud of the battlefield. It's an entirely different experience reading the books, and one I recommend if you're as obsessed with this series as I am. God, I hope not. Next time I'm going to be digging into the next arc where Tanya really tastes despair, as well as just the general ineptitude on the Eastern Front. But for now, hey, you made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with a link down in the description. If you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon and pick up some extra perks, like voting on what I do next. And speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to Nadeshiko for their continued support. Thanks for watching.